Inside the imperial wing of the Palatine Hill, the air carries the metallic stench of fresh blood. A polished blade taps softly against a basin of pale stone. The physicians scrub their fingers with practiced calm. They are not here to preserve a life. They are here to dismantle one. A young boy lies stretched across the slab. His thighs are still wet from the cut that took his manhood. The doctors will not allow him the mercy of dying. As his body trembles and bleeds, the noblest men of Rome gather around him. They smear white lead across his cheeks. They drape his ruined frame in the violet silk of an empress, already buried. Beyond the heavy doors, the most feared Senate ever assembled stands ready to clap. This is not gossip drifting through the alleys of the Subura. The year is AD 67. Emperor Nero has just commanded the greatest empire ever built to bring his dead wife back to life by sculpting her face, her body, and her name into the flesh of a teenage slave called Sporus. The true horror of this story is not the insanity of one ruler. It is the cold precision of the apparatus that obeyed him. No one resisted. No one cried out. The senators, the lawyers, and the bureaucrats of Rome opened their account books, approved the expenses, and bent the legal code to turn a private nightmare into official imperial policy. Welcome to the most grotesque wedding ceremony ever recorded. Today, we strip away the gleaming marble of the Eternal City to reveal an empire that financed and applauded the slow destruction of a human being. You are about to see what an empire does when it begins treating people as raw material to be cut, shaped, and discarded. Before we walk down into the dark, leave a comment telling me what city and country you are watching from right now. Hit that subscribe button and join the project. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel on the planet. The Roman slave market never sold human beings. It sold equipment, specialized, calibrated, biological equipment. Imperial jurists drafted entire legal codes to classify each category of property. A field laborer was filed under instrumentum vocale, a tool that happens to speak. They were muscles bred to drag plows through volcanic soil and swing iron blades through wheat until their vertebrae collapsed and overseers tossed the broken bodies into trenches outside the city walls. But beneath the shaded colonnades of the Central Forum, traders moved a far more delicate stock. They sold the poor delicatus. These boys were not workers. They were ornaments crafted in skin and bone. Every aspect of their physical form was engineered. Their meals were measured to keep their flesh soft and pliable. Their bodies were polished each morning with volcanic pumice to scrape away any sign of hardening or callus. Their hair was twisted into perfect ringlets using bronze rods heated over coals. A boy stood on a slowly turning wooden disc known as the catasta. White chalk coated the soles of his feet. The chalk announced he was foreign cargo, hauled across the sea from the eastern edges of the empire. He carried no family name. He held no legal protection. He was an empty page waiting for a buyer to inscribe a function across his existence. The auctioneers called out a single word above his head: Sporus. He matched a very specific physical formula. His hair carried the warm tone of dark amber. His cheekbones cut sharp angles into his face. His skin held the pale finish of imported alabaster. These coordinates aligned with a corpse. In the year AD 65, an earthquake struck the soul of the Roman state. Emperor Nero severed the last thread, tying him to the rational world. His wife, the Empress Poppaea Sabina, was gone. She had been carrying his child. The surviving accounts point to a violent argument inside the imperial chambers, ending when Nero drove his foot into her swollen stomach. Her death cracked the emperor in places that could not be repaired. He did not respond with the dignified composure expected of a Roman patrician. He responded by tearing apart the most ancient customs of his bloodline. Romans burned their dead. They constructed elaborate pyres to free the soul and reduce the body to clean ash. Nero forbade the flames. He commanded that her corpse be preserved intact. The imperial supply chain mobilized to satisfy his sorrow. Aromatic spices were ordered by the cartload. Pliny the Elder later catalogued the staggering economic damage of this single funeral. Nero burned an amount of Arabian frankincense that surpassed the total annual yield of the entire region. Heavy merchant ships dragged crates of resin across the Mediterranean. Oxen pulled wagons up the Via Appia under the weight of perfumed gum. The empire incinerated its treasury to disguise the smell of an empress slowly turning to liquid. The court physicians embalmed her body. They filled the emptied cavities of her chest and abdomen with myrrh and ground cinnamon. They wrapped her in fine linen strips. She was sealed inside the mausoleum of Augustus. But a stuffed corpse cannot raise a wine cup at a banquet. A preserved shell cannot turn its head and laugh. Nero needed a living copy. Imperial agents fanned out across the streets of Rome and into every corner of the provinces. They carried wax tablets etched with the precise physical measurements of the dead empress. They combed through the slave markets stall by stall. They walked into the private homes of senators and inspected their household property. They appraised thousands of human faces with the cold focus of jewelers grading gemstones. They found Sporus. The transaction was filed and closed within an afternoon. Coins shifted from the imperial vault into a slaver's locked chest. A scribe drew a line through a name on an inventory ledger. Soldiers loaded the boy onto a sealed wagon and drove him toward the Palatine Hill. He was not told where he was going. He was a piece of furniture being moved into a room that had recently been emptied. The boy reached the imperial palace. The emperor stepped into the chamber to inspect the new acquisition. He studied the amber hair. He measured the angle of the jaw. The geometry was acceptable. The anatomy was wrong. Nero issued the order. The bureaucratic machinery of the most powerful state on earth received the command and processed it without pause. The empire prepared to surgically modify its own property. The court summoned the most accomplished surgeons within reach of the imperial road network. Most were almost certainly drawn from Alexandria, the medical heart of the ancient world. These were not crude butchers. They were pioneers who dissected human cadavers to chart the nervous system. They mapped the rivers of veins running beneath the skin. They followed the surgical doctrines laid down by writers like Celsus. Celsus instructed that a true surgeon must possess steady fingers and a hand that does not tremble. He must hold a mind so disciplined that he can ignore the screaming of his patient and focus only on the perfect execution of the cut. The imperial quartermasters stocked the surgical chamber with everything the procedure demanded. They delivered instruments forged from copper alloyed with zinc to resist corrosion. They arranged scalpels with leaf-shaped blades along a polished tray. They placed bronze cauterizing discs into braziers filled with glowing charcoal. The room smelled of heated metal and the sharp bite of vinegar used to scrub the marble countertops. Tall olive oil lamps burned along the walls. Polished silver mirrors caught the firelight and threw it directly onto the operating slab. Guards stripped the boy bare. They lifted him onto the wooden platform. They cinched thick leather straps around his wrists. They bound his ankles to the corners of the table. The chief physician approached, carrying a sea sponge. The sponge was saturated with a brewed solution of mandragora root, henbane, and concentrated opium. They pressed it across his nose and mouth. The bitter liquid trickled down the back of his throat. His pulse slowed. His vision blurred into a dense fog. The narcotics dulled the edges of his fear. They did not stop the deeper nerves from firing every signal of catastrophic damage to his brain. The lead surgeon made the first incision. The bronze edge slid through the skin. Blood ran across the table and spilled onto the stone tiles below. Slaves stood ready in the corners holding buckets of boiling water and stacks of fresh sponges. The castration was not crude. It was a methodical, almost reverent dissection. The surgeon located the major arteries. He clamped them shut with iron forceps. He severed the surrounding tissue with practiced strokes. The assistants passed him the heated metal discs. He pressed the glowing bronze directly against the open arteries. The heat fused the vessels in an instant. White smoke rose from the wound and curled toward the ceiling. The chamber filled with the smell of burning fat and scorched blood. The boy clawed his way back to consciousness through the chemical haze. His spine arched off the wood. His wrists thrashed against the leather until the skin around his forearms split open. He screamed. The physicians did not look at his face. They studied the surgical edges. They confirmed the bleeding had stopped. They packed the deep cavity with strips of lint soaked in sour wine and crushed honey. The honey acted as a natural barrier against bacterial infection. They wrapped his lower body tightly in clean linen bandages. A clerk standing at the doorway recorded the time of completion on a wax-coated scroll. The male body had been administratively erased. The boy lay sealed inside a darkened recovery chamber for weeks. Sepsis was the silent assassin that haunted every surgical patient in the ancient world. Slaves changed his bandages at every sunrise. They watched his forehead for the heat of fever. The torn edges of the wound slowly fused into a thick band of scar tissue. The sharp pain eventually dulled into a constant background ache that would never leave him. But the surgery was only the foundation. The true reconstruction required the slow flaying of his mind. Calvia Crispinilla entered the chamber. She was a noblewoman of immense rank. The historian Tacitus called her the Magister Libidines. She was the imperial supervisor of vices. She managed the darkest cravings of the emperor and made sure they were satisfied with discretion and skill. Now she had been appointed as the lead architect of the new Poppaea. She moved her belongings into the boy's quarters. She began the methodical demolition of everything he had ever been. She established the first law. The name Sporus had been buried with the male body. Any slave or guard who spoke that name in the boy's hearing received 50 lashes across the back. Calvia dressed him in the heavy ceremonial tunics of a Roman matron. She wrapped him in silk, dyed with Tyrian purple. The dye was harvested from the decomposing glands of thousands of murex sea snails crushed in seaside vats. It carried the scent of low tide mixed with absolute imperial power. She loaded gold chains around his neck until the weight pulled at his collarbones. She covered his skin in the specific blends of balsam and cinnamon oil that Poppaea had imported from the eastern caravan routes. Calvia rewired his physical mechanics. A boy raised in the slave pens walked with a long, open stride. Calvia carried a slim wooden rod. Whenever his gait slipped back into something masculine, she struck him sharply behind the knees. She drilled him until he adopted the constrained floating steps of a noblewoman moving in a stola. She corrected the position of his hands. She adjusted the tilt of his head. She slapped his shoulders down until they curved into a feminine line. She attacked his voice next. He had to crush the natural resonance rising from his chest. He learned to speak from the highest registers of his throat. He had to imitate the precise musical cadence of the dead woman. He had to copy her laugh, her sighs, the exact way she pronounced the names of her favorite poets. This was a primitive form of trauma-based identity reconstruction. Calvia drilled him from the first light of dawn until the lamps were extinguished at night. She interrogated him on every detail of Poppaea's history. She forced him to memorize the names of the empress's previous husbands, lovers, enemies, and political rivals. If he stumbled on a single name, she stripped him of sleep. Guards kept him awake for 2 full days, using buckets of cold water poured slowly over his skull. If he recited the lessons flawlessly, she rewarded him with imported dates, iced honey wine, and gentle words. The human mind cannot endure that level of sustained cognitive pressure without fracturing somewhere deep inside. After months of sleep starvation, physical correction, chemical sedation, and constant identity assault, the boy's neural circuits began to rewire themselves. To survive the unbearable conditions of his daily existence, the original self surrendered the controls. The boy named Sporus retreated into a small, locked room buried at the back of his own skull. The fabricated ghost of Poppaea Sabina stepped forward and took the wheel of the body. This entire process of dismantling a human being requires a wide network of silent partners. It requires clerks, guards, physicians, accountants, and noblewomen to collectively agree that a person is nothing more than raw clay to be molded. This is exactly why we excavate these archives. We do not just list off dates and battles. We dissect the inner workings of power and the deafening silence of the crowds who watched it happen. By joining our membership program, The Lineage, you step beyond the velvet ropes of mainstream history. You become an insider in the truest sense. You directly fund the deep research that drags these buried blueprints back into the daylight. Your membership keeps this entire operation alive and grants you early access to the investigations that the algorithms try to bury. If you want to understand how empires really operate behind the marble facades, join the ranks. Support the mission. The training cycle finally ended. Calvia Crispinilla brought her finished work before the emperor. Nero walked into the private chamber alone. He did not see a mutilated boy purchased from a provincial market. He saw the painted face. He breathed in the Arabian incense. He heard the practiced rhythm of a familiar voice greeting him from across the room. The delusion clicked into place inside his skull. The emperor smiled at his wife. The private nightmare was now operational. The architects had successfully constructed their ghost in the flesh. But an emperor of Rome does not keep his greatest victories sealed behind closed bronze doors. The private torture was finished. Now Rome demanded a public ceremony. In AD 66, the imperial court evacuated Italy. The emperor never traveled in modest fashion. Nero assembled an entire floating metropolis of administrators, soldiers, courtiers, and professional flatterers. They boarded a fleet of long-oared galleys at the southern port of Brundisium. Hundreds of wooden oars cracked the surface of the sea in perfect synchronized rhythm. The fleet pushed eastward across the open water. Their target was the province of Achaia. The supreme ruler of the known world had decided to personally compete in the Pan-Hellenic Games. He brought his newly fabricated wife along to witness his glory. The Mediterranean sun pounded the wooden decks without mercy. The harsh light exposed the surreal absurdity of the imperial procession. Sporus reclined beneath a heavy canopy of imported linen. Slaves moved cool air toward his face, with enormous fans built from ostrich plumes. He wore the long stola of a Roman matron. He stared out at the rolling expanse of dark blue water. Across the eastern coast, Greek cities scrambled in panic to prepare for the arrival of their absolute sovereign. Civic magistrates emptied their treasury vaults to finance the welcome ceremonies. They erected enormous triumphal arches across the avenues. They commissioned new marble statues from local sculptors. They received the official manifest of the imperial household from incoming military couriers. The parchment listed the Emperor Nero alongside the Empress Sabina. The magistrates dared not ask a single question. They commanded the stonecutters to carve both names into the public monuments. The state demanded a wife. The empire dutifully delivered one. The fleet anchored at Corinth. The local aristocracy lined the stone piers in long ranks. They lowered themselves to the ground as the emperor stepped off the gangway. They kept their faces pressed against the dust as the mutilated teenager descended the ramp behind him. The illusion held without a crack. Nero entered the ancient sacred games. The athletic officials hastily rewrote the holy schedule to make space for him. They added musical performances to a festival historically reserved for raw physical combat. The emperor stood barefoot in the dust of the open arena. He plucked at the strings of a 10-stringed lyre. He sang long Greek tragedies in a strained voice. He expected total worship from the audience. The audience supplied it. 10,000 citizens packed the curved benches of the stone amphitheater. They roasted under the unrelenting summer heat. They sat through hours of the tyrant straining his vocal cords. Praetorian soldiers stood at every exit, with naked blades resting against their shoulders. They watched the spectators rather than the show. If a citizen drifted into sleep, a soldier scratched the offender's name into a wax tablet. If a citizen stopped clapping, an executioner was assigned. The applause shook the stones of the building. It was not born from genuine appreciation. It was born from cold mathematical survival. High inside the imperial viewing box, Sporus watched the spectacle unfold. He sat with his back perfectly straight. Calvia Crispinilla occupied the seat directly beside him. She studied his posture for any sign of slippage. The boy lived inside a sensory limbo. He smelled the sweat of thousands of bodies and the smoke of roasted lamb from the street vendors below. He heard the painful pitch of the emperor's voice bouncing off the polished marble. He felt the weight of the gold collar pressing into the soft skin of his neck. He did not utter a word. His silence was the rent he paid to keep breathing. The Eastern tour finally ended. The court returned to the capital. Nero declared the physical resurrection complete. The ghost now needed official legal recognition from the apparatus of the state. The emperor announced a royal wedding. Roman marriage was never a romantic affair. It was a tightly regulated legal contract designed to transfer wealth, consolidate alliances, and produce legitimate male heirs. The vast bureaucracy of Rome activated to process the impossible. Scribes unrolled fresh sheets of papyrus across long tables. They dipped sharpened bronze pens into pots of black iron gall ink. They drafted the tabulae nuptials. This was the legally binding marriage contract. It required the formal declaration of a dowry. The imperial treasury opened its vaults to provide the funds. Tax revenue squeezed from the grain ships sailing out of Egypt was used to finance the wealth of a fictional bride. The state religion was hauled into the delusion next. Roman tradition required that sacred omens be read before any wedding ceremony. Priests known as augurs gathered on the heights of the Palatine Hill. They watched the migration patterns of birds streaking across the morning sky. Another priest sacrificed a young pig on a stone altar. He cut the animal open. He examined the steaming liver under the morning light, searching for any blemish or imperfection. The priests publicly declared the omens favorable. The gods themselves had approved the union. The bureaucracy filed the divine consent in triplicate. The paperwork demanded the signatures of living men. It required the names of 10 witnesses of senatorial rank. 10 of the most powerful aristocrats in the empire stepped forward in turn. They pressed their massive gold signet rings into pools of warm wax. They sealed a state document verifying the legal union between the Emperor of Rome and a biological male whom he had personally ordered surgically altered just months earlier. Not one of them hesitated. The ink dried on the parchment. The lie became binding legal precedent for the entire empire. A Roman bride required a paterfamilias. A father figure had to formally hand the woman over to the groom in ceremonial fashion. Nero appointed Ophonius Tigellinus to play the role. This single casting choice elevated the horror from grotesque delusion into the realm of pure psychological torture. Tigellinus was the Praetorian prefect. He commanded the imperial guard. He was the emperor's personal enforcer. He had begun his career as a horse breeder out in the provinces. He ended it as the head of the most feared secret police force in the ancient world. His hands were soaked in the blood of half the ancient noble bloodlines of Rome. He personally organized the state torture chambers beneath the city. Years before this wedding, Tigellinus had played an active role in the political maneuvering that ultimately led to the death of the original Poppaea. Now, this very architect of her demise was being cast in the role of the doting father, giving her replacement away at the altar. Tigellinus walked into the dressing chamber where the boy was being prepared. The eyes of the assassin met the eyes of the victim. Tigellinus possessed a sharp, ruthlessly calculating mind. He knew precisely what stood in front of him. He understood the boy was a prop made of bleeding meat. But the prefect was the consummate survivor. He survived by perfectly executing every script the emperor handed him. Tigellinus lifted the flammeum from a velvet cushion. This was the traditional flame-orange veil worn by every Roman bride. He arranged the heavy fabric over the amber hair. He tied the nodus Herculaneus, the sacred knot of Hercules, around the boy's slender waist. The killer performed the ancient domestic ritual with grave precision. The theater required his flawless performance. The wedding unfolded in the pulsing heart of the capital. The streets of Rome were swept clean by armies of slaves working through the night. Saffron-laced incense burned on every street corner to mask the chronic stench of the city. The procession started at sunset. Torchbearers led the way through the cramped alleys. Flute players filled the air with a thin, piercing music. A choir of young boys raised their voices in the hymenius, the traditional wedding chant. Sporus walked through the dead center of the city. He was flanked on both sides by matrons of honor. These were the wives of the most senior senators. They held his arms. They guided his constrained, gliding steps over the rough basalt paving stones. The citizens of Rome packed every street and rooftop. The plebeians showered the procession with lotus blossoms. They shouted blessings for the new imperial couple. The crowd swelled into the tens of thousands. They strained their necks to glimpse the figure beneath the veil. Some already knew the truth through the sprawling underground network of urban gossip. Some genuinely believed the official state proclamations posted in the forum. It made no difference whatsoever. The physical truth of the boy was completely irrelevant. The crowd cheered for the symbol the state had ordered them to celebrate. The empire commanded joy. The citizens dutifully manufactured it. The procession arrived at the foot of the Palatine Hill. The enormous bronze doors of the banquet hall swung open. The Senate was waiting inside. This is the molten core of the entire nightmare. Look closely at the men reclining on the carved ivory couches. These were the heirs of the Roman Republic. They traced their bloodlines directly back to the men who had once expelled the kings. They studied Stoic philosophy in their private libraries. They quoted Cicero from memory. They understood logic, biology, anatomy, and constitutional law. They knew with absolute certainty that a castrated teenager could not bear any children whatsoever. They knew the emperor was forcing them into a collective hallucination. And yet, they rose to their feet. They lifted their heavy silver goblets into the lamplight. They cheered with manufactured ecstasy. Why did they comply? The answer is buried in the cold mechanics of tyranny. The lex majestatis dictated their every move. This was the law of treason. Under Nero, treason was no longer defined as raising a rebel army against the state. Treason had been redefined as a failure of enthusiasm. If a single senator was caught frowning during the wedding, a paid informer would record it on a tablet. By the next sunrise, a centurion would arrive at his villa with a sealed order. The order would instruct him to open his own veins in a warm bath that very afternoon. Survival under this regime demanded active and visible participation in the madness. The elite did not merely tolerate the wedding. They aggressively competed with one another to validate it more loudly. A senior senator approached the bridal couple. He bowed so deeply, his forehead pressed against the cold mosaic floor. He poured a libation of vintage wine across the colored stones. He raised his hands toward the painted ceiling above. He prayed aloud to the gods of Olympus. He prayed that the new empress would soon bear strong, healthy sons to secure the future of the imperial succession. He spoke these words while staring directly into the hollow eyes of the mutilated boy. The other senators murmured their solemn agreement. They nodded in grave approval. This was the terminal stage of social decay. It was the precise moment when intelligent, educated men weaponized their own intelligence to justify their own cowardice. They built an elaborate fortress of compliance around themselves. They convinced themselves that playing along was a sophisticated long-term political strategy. In reality, they were simply hostage victims dressed in expensive silk. They cheered the slow destruction of a boy in order to delay their own executions by exactly 24 hours. The feast began. Servants paraded into the hall carrying enormous silver platters loaded with roasted dormice glazed in honey and dusted with poppy seeds. They served entire flamingo tongues stacked in pyramids and slices of seasoned ostrich. They poured aged Falernian wine from carved crystal amphorae. The noise inside the banquet hall was deafening. Musicians worked massive water-powered organs in the corners. Dancers spun across the open floors in flowing robes. Nero presided from the elevated head table. He beamed with paternal pride. He fed imported grapes one by one into the mouth of the boy reclining beside him. Sporus chewed the fruit. He tasted absolutely nothing. He sat at the absolute geometric center of human power on Earth. He was surrounded by the wealthiest men on the planet. He was completely alone. He was a single object trapped inside a room full of ghosts wearing human skin. The elite spoke directly to him, but every word was addressed to the dead woman buried in the mausoleum across the city. They complimented the cut of his garments. They politely inquired after his health. He delivered the practiced responses one by one. He modulated his voice to land on the precise musical pitch Calvia Crispinilla had drilled into his throat through months of sleepless nights. He never once broke character. He understood the cost of failure with brutal clarity. The scalpel had already taken his body. The crowd was now finishing the job by taking his reality. The ceremony approached its climax. The time arrived for the formal exchange of gifts between bride and groom. Nero reached into a small carved wooden box on the table beside him. He withdrew a heavy gold ring. The ring featured an engraved gemstone set deep into the band. Roman signet rings carried enormous symbolic weight. They were instruments of absolute authority. They sealed legal documents. They projected the wearer's identity across the entire empire. Nero slid the ring slowly onto the boy's finger. The gemstone caught the flickering yellow light of the surrounding oil lamps. The image carved into the gem did not depict Venus, the goddess of love. It did not depict Juno, the goddess of marriage and the household. The intaglio cut deep into the stone showed Proserpina. She was the goddess of the underworld. She was the deity who had been violently abducted by Pluto and dragged down into the eternal darkness of Hades. She was the queen of the dead. The symbolism was crushing. It was undeniable to anyone in the room with eyes to see. Nero was openly acknowledging the truth in plain sight. He was marrying a corpse. He was crowning a queen of shadows. The boy looked down at the ring on his finger. The gold pressed cold against his skin. He understood the carved image immediately. He knew he had been dragged into a subterranean hell from which no living soul ever returned. He closed his fingers slowly into a fist. He hid the face of the goddess inside his palm. He did not weep. He accepted the chain that had been wrapped around his soul. To grasp the granular details of this psychological descent, you cannot lean on sanitized textbook summaries written for nervous classrooms. You need the raw archival data, the specific evidence detailing the legal mechanics of this entire nightmare, is documented with surgical precision inside the primary source we relied on while researching this script. That book is an absolute masterpiece of macabre historical investigation. It is available right now through the View Products button on your screen. You need to own this text to truly understand the bureaucratic depth of the Roman machine. Alongside the book, we have curated a selection of themed relics inspired by the darkest corners of imperial history. Explore the shelf. Discover what other immersive treasures and dark memorabilia are waiting to complete your collection. Open the shop shelf on your screen. Browse the vault while the story continues. The wedding finally concluded. The guests stumbled out into the warm Roman night. They retreated to their heavily guarded villas behind walls patrolled by private soldiers. They had survived another day of the emperor's reign. The vast empire continued its grinding rotation. Grain ships kept arriving at the port of Ostia. Legions kept marching across the frozen mud of Britannia. The state machine kept processing taxes and executing prisoners. Inside the palace, the boy named Sporus quietly disappeared. The Empress Poppaea Sabina now walked the marble halls in his place. Months slowly bled into an entire year. The illusion appeared to be permanent, but the foundation stones of the empire were cracking beneath the unbearable weight of its own extravagance. The provinces were financially exhausted. The military commanders stationed in Gaul and Spain examined the imperial accounts arriving by courier. They saw the bankruptcy in black ink. They saw the emperor singing on Greek stages, while the legions went unpaid for months on end. They stopped shipping silver back to the capital. They sharpened the edges of their iron blades. In AD 68, the rebellion finally ignited. A provincial governor named Vindex raised an army in Gaul. A hardened general named Galba began marching his veterans toward Rome. The Senate immediately sensed the shifting winds. The same men who had publicly prayed for the boy to bear sons suddenly remembered their long-buried dignity. They convened in secret meetings under torchlight. They formally declared Nero a public enemy of the Roman state. The Praetorian Guard abandoned the palace gates without a fight. The sycophants and courtiers fled into the countryside on horseback. The emperor descended into pure panic. He slipped out of the city under the cover of darkness. He hid inside a suburban villa belonging to a freedman. As the hoofbeats of approaching cavalry echoed against the outer wall, he drove a dagger deep into his own throat. The tyrant was finally dead. The architect of the entire madness was gone. The regime collapsed into smoking ash overnight. You might naturally assume the nightmare ended at this exact moment. You might think the mutilated boy was finally free to pull off the veil and walk away into the morning sunlight as a free human being. You would be catastrophically wrong. In Rome, when the master dies in the middle of the night, the furniture does not stand up and walk away on its own. The furniture is inherited by the new master. The true nightmare was only just beginning. AD 68. Nero is dead. The body of the final Julio-Claudian emperor has barely cooled on the floor of a suburban villa. The Palatine Hill spirals into bureaucratic chaos within hours. Servants pry the gold leaf off the walls and stuff it into their tunics. The Praetorian Guard breaks into the imperial treasury and hauls out chests of silver. At the dead center of this swirling power vacuum sits Sporus. He does not run. He has nowhere on earth to run to. He owns no family, no legal identity, and no coin to his name. He is officially classified as property of the imperial estate. When a Roman estate changes hands in the night, the new owner automatically inherits the livestock, the furniture, and the slaves still breathing inside it. The first man to seize the vacant throne is Nymphidius Sabinus. He commands the Praetorian Guard. He personally engineered Nero's collapse through carefully placed bribes. He marches into the palace and lifts the imperial signet ring from a velvet cushion. He also takes possession of the boy. Nymphidius does not dismantle the existing illusion. He doubles down on it. He forces Sporus to walk at his side through the corridors. He publicly addresses him not as a teenage boy, but as Poppaea. This is a coldly calculated political maneuver. Nymphidius lacks any drop of royal blood in his veins. He uses the breathing replica of the former empress as a stage prop to legitimize his usurpation in front of the troops. He parades the boy before his soldiers in the courtyard. The legionaries do not care about the legal fiction one way or the other. They only care about the size of their cash bonuses. They assassinate Nymphidius within months of his rise. Sporus is dragged back into the imperial inventory and refiled. An aging general named Galba arrives from the dust of Spain. He claims the imperial purple. He marches into Rome at the head of the 7th Legion. He governs with a kind of grim military austerity. He orders the immediate execution of every former ally of Nero he can identify. He massacres the thousands of Marines that Nero had hastily drafted into the urban service. The streets of Rome run red with the blood of soldiers killing soldiers. Galba pays no attention to Sporus. The boy stays locked inside the imperial apartments behind sealed doors. He sits alone in the dark for hours at a stretch. He listens to the muffled screams of the executions echoing up from the streets below his window. Galba's reign lasts exactly 7 months. The Praetorian Guard quickly grows tired of his discipline and his moralizing. He refuses to pay them their customary cash bonuses on principle. They hack the old man into pieces in the Roman Forum on a cold January morning. They leave his decapitated body abandoned near the Lacus Curtius for the dogs. January, AD 69. A fresh emperor ascends. His name is Marcus Salvius Otho. This is the precise moment the entire narrative bends into something deeper and more suffocating. Otho is no stranger to the imperial household. He is no random general arriving from the frontier. Years before any of this began, before the madness, Before the surgeon's blade ever touched skin, Otho was a high-ranking nobleman at court. He was married. He genuinely loved his wife. That woman was the original Poppaea Sabina. Nero had developed an obsession with Otho's wife. The emperor had forced Otho to formally divorce her. He then exiled Otho to the distant province of Lusitania at the far western edge of the empire. Otho spent 10 long years on the literal edge of the known world. He fed a slow, rotting resentment inside his chest the entire time. Now Otho returns. He wears the imperial oak wreath on his brow. He marches back into the palace as its new master. He demands to inspect the estate he has just inherited. The guards bring him the boy. Stand inside that room with him for a moment. Otho stops on the colored mosaic floor. He stares at the teenager dressed in the clothing of his dead wife. He breathes in the specific cinnamon and balsam perfume that his wife used to wear in life. He listens to the artificial pitch of her voice rising from the throat of a castrated slave. For Sporus, the psychological pressure becomes physically unbearable. He spent 2 long years performing as Poppaea for a man who only wanted a delusion. Now, he must perform the role of Poppaea for a man who actually shared her bed for years. Otho remembers the exact musical cadence of her laugh. He remembers the precise way she curled her fingers around the stem of a wine glass. Sporus must navigate a buried minefield of intimate memories he never lived through. If he breaks character even for a heartbeat, the torture chambers wait beneath the palace. If his performance falls even slightly short, he reminds the new emperor of the woman that was stolen from him and the decade of grief that followed. The historical sources tell us Otho embraced the madness without resistance. He addressed the boy as Poppaea in public and in private. He kept him inside the imperial quarters. They dined together by candlelight. The new ruler of the known world sat across the table from a mutilated mirror, reflecting his greatest personal loss back at him every evening. This is no longer political maneuvering. This is a controlled descent into collective psychosis. The man at the apex of the world using a human being as a prosthetic limb for his own grief. The hallucination shatters in April AD 69. The legions stationed in Germany refuse to recognize Otho as their emperor. They declare their own commander, Aulus Vitellius, the rightful sovereign instead. Vitellius marches his heavy infantry across the snow-covered passes of the Alps. The two armies finally collide on the open plains near Bedriacum. The slaughter that follows is industrial in scale. 40,000 Romans butcher one another in the spring mud. Otho receives the news of the catastrophic defeat by courier. He does not flee the capital. He retires to his private chamber and drives a dagger straight into his own chest. Vitellius enters Rome. He is a man of legendary gluttony and casual cruelty. He surveys the captured palace room by room. He inspects the surviving members of Otho's court like a butcher checking livestock. He looks at Sporus. Vitellius carries no emotional attachment whatsoever to the ghost of Poppaea Sabina. He despises Nero. He despises Otho. To Vitellius, the boy is a contaminated symbol of 2 failed regimes. He is a broken, discarded toy left behind in the playroom. Vitellius decides the state has already extracted every drop of political value from this particular piece of flesh. The time has come to extract entertainment value instead. Roman justice was never administered quietly. It was an elaborate theatrical enterprise. They did not simply execute condemned criminals behind closed doors. They orchestrated lavish, lethal stage productions known as fatal charades. They forced the condemned to physically reenact mythological deaths on the sand of the arena. If the chosen myth required a character to burn alive, The prisoner was dressed in a tunic soaked in pine pitch and set ablaze in front of the cheering crowd. If the myth required a character to be devoured, the prisoner was chained to a rock as starved leopards were released from their cages. Vitellius summons his event planners. He sentences Sporus to the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the wild beasts. The emperor personally designs a custom scenario for the execution. He remembers the engraved ring Nero gave the boy on his wedding night, the ring of Proserpina, the goddess of the underworld. Vitellius orders the imperial engineers to construct a working replica of Hades inside the gladiatorial amphitheater. The plan is brutally specific. They will dress Sporus in the sheer ceremonial garments of the goddess. They will lash him to a wooden stake driven into the white sand at the center of the floor. Roman engineering extended its genius even into their methods of execution. They had perfected a system of trapdoors and counterweights known as the hegmatu. These wooden elevators silently hoisted cages of starving wild animals from the dark subterranean tunnels directly up onto the arena floor. The animals were kept in absolute darkness for days at a stretch. They were starved beyond reason. Handlers fed them only the warm blood of butchered horses to drive their hunger into pure feral rage. Vitellius wanted Sporus tied to a stake positioned directly above one of these trapdoors. He wanted the boy to feel the deep mechanical vibration of the rising platform beneath his bare feet before the wood splintered open. He wanted the crowd to watch the violent dismemberment of the boy who once played empress at the most expensive wedding in Roman history. The spectacle would serve as a final blood-soaked punctuation mark on the entire legacy of Nero. The guards strip Sporus of his fine silk robes. They dress him in coarse, scratching linen. They drag him out of the comfortable rooms of the Palatine Palace. They march him through the open streets to the holding cells beneath the amphitheater seating. The sensory shift is brutal and immediate. He leaves a world of saffron incense and polished silver mirrors. He enters a subterranean stone corridor that runs beneath thousands of paying spectators. The air down there reeks of animal waste, rancid sweat, and rotting flesh. He hears the deep roar of starved lions vibrating through the iron grates above his head. He hears the crowd stomping their feet against the wooden benches. The citizens of Rome are taking their seats for the show. The same citizens who once threw lotus blossoms at his wedding procession are now buying cheap wine from vendors and placing wagers on exactly how many minutes his ribs will protect his organs. Sporus sits in the dark holding cell. He is 19 years old. His entire short existence has been dictated by the whims of powerful men. A slave merchant erased his past. A surgeon erased his sex. An emperor erased his identity. A second emperor turned him into a living ghost for grief. A third emperor has now scheduled his public butchery before a roaring mob. He has never made a single meaningful decision in his own life. The guards prepare the heavy wooden doors at the end of the corridor. The animal handlers prime the beasts with hot iron prods through the bars. The crowd above roars for the spilling of blood. Sporus looks around the inside of his cell. He surveys what tools are available to him. He finds a method. The exact mechanism of his suicide has been debated by historians for 2,000 years, but the outcome is never disputed. He does not wait for the guards to come for him. He does not walk out onto the sand to face the lions. He severs his own mortal thread by his own hand. The blood pools slowly across the cold stone floor. The guards eventually unlock the heavy door to retrieve their starring actor for the show. They find only a corpse waiting for them. Do not interpret this final act as a defeat. Recognize it as the first and only act of absolute sovereignty in his entire life. By taking his own life inside that stone cell, Sporus stole the climactic scene from the Roman Empire. He denied the howling mob the entertainment they had paid to see. He denied Vitellius the political victory he had so carefully designed. The single greatest military machine in human history had spent years sculpting his flesh, rewriting his mind, and engineering his destruction down to the last detail. In the final hour of the final act, a 19-year-old boy looked the entire empire dead in the eye, refused to play the part assigned to him, and shut the whole theater down. He died alone in the dark on a stone floor. He died as the absolute master of his own final breath. Today, millions of tourists wander through the ruins of the Roman Forum every year. They take photographs leaning against the broken stone columns. They buy plastic gladiator helmets from souvenir stalls. They marvel at the ancient civilization that built towering aqueducts and paved roads across 3 continents. They never see the blood dried deep into the mortar between the stones. The philosopher Hannah Arendt coined the phrase, "the banality of evil." She argued that the darkest atrocities in human history are almost never committed by snarling monsters. They are executed by ordinary bureaucrats. They are carried out by normal people doing their assigned jobs, following the standing orders, and refusing to question the system around them. The tragedy of Sporus is the ultimate historical proof of this concept written in flesh. The architects, the surgeons, the senators, the priests, and the cheering crowds all played their assigned parts without complaint. They constructed a vast machine that processed a single human soul into dust over the course of years, and they filed the paperwork and called it the law of the land. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story changed how you see the ancient world, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button below the video, and share this with someone who needs to see the unvarnished truth of history. You have just watched another premium documentary from Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. Watch it immediately. The descent into the buried past continues.